Good afternoon, ladies. I think I saw another gentleman here besides Ed. Thank you for coming out on this wet and windy day for our program. Before we start, I wanted to give a shout out to Sherry Yoshizu for creating our setting for the program. She has these wonderful Pixar movie posters. So we thank you very much. We appreciate you bringing them, Sherry. Our guest today is a visionary leader in the world of computer graphics and has profoundly impacted the animation industry. As co-founder and president of Pixar and president of Disney Animation Studios, a career which has spanned more than 40 years. Please welcome Ed Catmull and my co-chair Leslie DeLone, who will be serving as moderator.
Hello?
Hello.
I am so pleased we've got Ed in a room with about 150 women. I think it's a dream come true.
I appreciate that. You're right.
And I know for a fact, Ed, you have impacted every single woman in this room with their children and their grandchildren. And I'm so happy you're here. But I think we'll just start, and I'm going to ask you, where were you born?
I forget. It was a long time ago. As we go through this, incidentally, I have 50 years of rabbit holes to go down. So we've agreed with Leslie that what she'll do is she'll wink at me to let me know it's time to move on. Oh, yeah. For Leslie to wink at me if I'm going on too long or to knock the table. Gets a little too far to kick. I was born in West Virginia. It was near the end of the war. My father was in Iwo Jima. And then the war ended. He came back, got my mother, and they moved back to Utah. So I was raised in Salt Lake City and was there for the first almost 30 years of my life.
And then after that, you went to university locally?
Yes, the University of Utah. There's I don't want to go through all that, but the important thing to me was I was there and I sneaked into the graduate school in computer science, which is, I'd been in physics originally, and then I switched over to computer science. And my first two courses were taught by men who later received the Turing Award for very different reasons, for their profound effect. The Turing Award in the engineering community, because there is no a Nobel Prize for that. So that's their equivalent. So these are all laureates. So my first two teachers were profoundly influential in my life. And one of them talked about what it means to have long-term rapid change. So that was a good foundation. And the other one was, within the context of a large vision, you still take a step at a time. And these were important grounding lessons for me as I started off. But the other one was, I intended originally to study artificial intelligence, of all things. But my first class was in computer graphics, when, bong, I could combine art and technology in one thing. And I just switched over. This is the cool thing to do. It's like an Easter egg hunt, and I'm at the front of the line, and they just cut the line. But the other thing at Utah was that when I graduated 4 years later, I could look back on it and say, I absolutely loved my time there. That the people who set up that environment had created something which is open and sharing and supportive. And when I left, I thought, this is the kind of environment I want to have for the rest of my life. And that was one of the most important things I got out of that experience.
And then what happened after university? What was the next step?
Well, computer science did not, at that time, perceive computer graphics as a legitimate field, so I couldn't get a job in computer science. So I went and I lived on Long Island for the next 5 years. There was a man who hoped to be the next Walt Disney. So he was essentially funding a research lab, and he had the money to do it. So at this point, he was willing to fund graphics in a way that nobody else did anywhere. But also, I had these theories about how to build a group, because as I said, I want to have this kind of environment. I'm not really in an academic environment. How do I build that kind of environment? So I had these theories, and some of them worked great, and some were an utter and complete crock. And I even backed myself into a corner because I didn't have the experience to get out of it. I was 30 years old, and it was the first time I managed anything. The things that I got right was early on, we decided to publish everything we did. And the president of the school was fine with that. There were other people who had the same kind of long-term vision, but they were secretive about what they came up with. And I just thought, well, we're so far away that to be secretive is actually foolish at this time, given the rate of the underlying technological change. The better thing to do was to engage completely with a larger community. So for my entire career, I have been entirely engaged in that community of computer graphics. But the reason I say this is not only was it important to engage with a broader community, but when I left after 5 years there to go to Lucasfilm, we did the same thing at Lucasfilm, and George was fine with that. George wanted to change the film industry, so the fact that we wanted to publish everything was great, and we attracted an extremely strong group then, actually, which laid the foundation for the change in the film industry, not just in animation, but everything you see with special effects, with ILM, came out of the things that we developed there. This group was so strong. Then after 5 years, Steve Jobs bought Pixar from Lucasfilm, and Steve was, before and then and afterwards, extraordinarily secretive, but he never questioned my decision to publish everything we did. Believe me, Apple does not do that. And Next didn't do that. But he did understand that this was about getting the best people, and that's what really mattered. So this was one of the things I got right at New York Tech. When I left New York Tech to go to Lucasfilm, I could look back, and first of all, going to Lucasfilm was like a do-over because I'd made these mistakes. But I looked back and said, well, about half of my decisions or theories were wrong, and about half were right. But I believe that going forward, the ratio of right to wrong would probably remain the same for the rest of my life. Now, the truth is, I don't have a way of measuring it. But for me, what was important was to understand that I was wrong more than I thought I was.
And tell me, I'm very interested about Steve Jobs. A couple of stories I'd like to hear. I've heard them. You talk about him. You said he was one of the most brilliant men.
Yes, but he had an arc. There's a book written by him that actually was an authorized biography that Steve authorized, and he interviewed everybody. But the unfortunate thing was that Steve was still alive when he was writing the book. So he was interviewing all these people, and it was well known at the time that in the early days at Apple, his behavior towards people wasn't very good, and his interaction wasn't very good. And so that's frankly kind of a sexy story. That's sort of the poor behavior, bad boy kind of story. But it's true. That's the way he was, and that's the way he was in the early days of Pixar. He was not easy to deal with. Now, in retrospect, I realized part of it was he'd just come through a nasty divorce, but it was very public, and the whole world knew that he'd been removed from Apple, and so he had, he was trying to prove himself, and but that was a difficult time for us and for him. But by the year 1991, things began to change. And there was a 4-year period in which there was a dramatic change in him. In 1991, his son Reed was born. He married Lorraine, and we signed the contract with Disney to make Toy Story. So that was 91. So now we've got 2 parallel transformations going on. After 20 years, the industry rather quickly, because they've been resistant to technical change, resistance is the wrong word, they actually didn't think it was relevant to them. It wasn't like they were opposed to it. It's like it wasn't solving their problem, which is different than being resistant in some ways, not in others. But so in 91, Terminator 2 came out, which was the first time there was a significant character in a live-action film, which is a silver robot in Terminator 2, that was all done with CG. So at that point, the industry is saying, ooh, this is a very different way of doing things. We've never seen anything like this before. In 1993, Jurassic Park came out. At that point, the whole industry is like, everything is changing. But also it's changing with video editing and with digital audio, which is the things we'd worked on at the computer division at Lucasfilm. Jurassic Park was a monumental film in terms of its impact. What most people don't know, even people who were in the industry, is that for those dinosaurs in that movie, there was only 7.5 minutes that were dinosaurs. That was it. And the fact that it's surprising to everybody, including me, says just how impactful that was. And in 1995, Toy Story came out, and we went public the week after it came out, with the logic being to the investors is, we don't want to go public until you see that we're doing something significant. That week of going public was the first business or commercial success that Steve had since being let go from Apple. So in this period of time, he transformed as a person. And we all saw this. After he made this transformation, the people who were with him stayed with him for the rest of his life. So when Isaacson was doing the interviewing, he interviewed all of us. And most of Steve's wealth actually came because of Pixar. Because we went public and he had a large share of it, as opposed to walking into Apple where there was things given to him as he rejoined the company. But it was actually Pixar. And he never sold a share, and then it was sold to Disney, which then increased afterwards, and he was on the board. So all that actually is what went to his wife after he died. So when they interviewed people, then nobody was going to psychoanalyze Steve while he was alive. So this arc, which is like, it's what we want in a movie. It's like an arc of a character. It's the hero's journey. Not there. So for those who have read it, it doesn't actually capture who he was.
So what you're saying is, behind every great man is a great woman.
I think that goes without saying.
I know his wife. I know it's true. What was your title?
Well, at Pixar, I was the president as it started off. But we were selling and manufacturing this special purpose graphics computer, which was far beyond what anybody else would do. but also being aware that the underlying change in chip speed was going to was still continuing at this rapid rate. People sometimes use the terminology of Moore's law having to do with the number of transistors on a chip, but it actually wasn't the real issue, and most people don't think of it in these terms. For most people, they think of exponential as fast. It means nothing else, just means fast. From a mathematical point of view, it doesn't mean fast. It can also mean decline, and if there's a complex number in it, it's used in physics for spinning. So it's just like a complete misuse of the term. A better term is compound growth, which people do understand in terms of the banks or the businesses. What's your compound rate of growth? Okay, so the question is, what's the cost of computing or the amount of computing per dollar? So the amount of computing per dollar has increased at a compound rate of 40% per year for over 60 years. All right, so when you put it in those terms, then people say, oh, that's really different. Because it's not a number, it's just like it's real. And that's what I've been working on the last couple of years, is how do you explain things to people? Because throughout the changes that took place in this industry, the number of companies that did incredibly stupid things for short-term reasons is astonishing. And these are people that should have known better. And now, of course, the entire world is affected by it, and so, making the same mistakes. And as we're now entering into a new era of scary growth.
Now, behind us, we've got these incredible posters, and I know you have a story behind every one. Can we start with Ratatouille? And which is your most popular one?
Well, personally, the first thing I should know is that the films, to me, don't have the same meaning as they do to people who see them, because they're embedded in the fact of knowing how they were made and the story behind them. So I can't answer, let's say, in an objective way as a non-participant. For me, there were like 4 or 5 films that really stand out, where there's a great deal of pride in the whole process. And obviously with Toy Story, our first one, was the realization, which even the people at Pixar sometimes forget, is that when we made that film, for the people who worked on it, none of us had actually made a computer animated film before, but nobody had worked on even a hand-drawn animated film before, or on any film before. None of us knew anything about what was there, other than the fact that we made some shorts and some commercials. So we had to figure everything out, and we did. So there's kind of a pride in that, and having changed and enabled other people, because we were friends with the people in these other companies who wanted to do something similar. Coco was a more recent movie. I was really proud of Coco. People they really worked hard to spend a lot of time in southern Mexico villages to understand the details of the culture, to put them into the movie. With Up, it had its own history. So Pete Docter, who's now the chief creative officer at the company, just sort of had a notion that he wanted, because he's very much driven by trying to get an emotional concept across. And so it went through these dramatic changes, but he then evolved over time, and it takes a little longer for his movies, except he gets there. And so there's a longer story behind that one. And then with Inside Out, with all these films, we do research, because you're trying to find something that people wouldn't normally know that's true. Because I believe if you see a film and there's something in there that's true, even if you don't know it's true, you sense that it's real. And in the case of Inside Out, their research was they talked with a lot of child psychologists. You know, what are the things confronting young children? What are those emotions at that age? With Ratatouille, it was conceived of by a man, which was an unlikely concept. I like unlikely concepts. Not that everything needs to be that way, but this is an unlikely concept because if you try to solve something which is really hard, you have to be more creative to do it. So a rat that wants to cook to convey the love of art, well, that's an unlikely concept. You know, in a lot of businesses and in the film world, they talk about the elevator pitch. You know, you want to present an idea to somebody and you want to have it so succinct and clear that you can explain the thing in the time that goes up in the elevator. Well, the best way to pass the elevator test is to do something that's derivative, right? It's the wrong thing. It's like, I hear it all the time. No, it's the wrong approach. Now, the thing about Ratatouille is not only could you not justify it in an elevator, you couldn't justify it in a week, and you couldn't justify it in a month. It's just a bad idea. So, but it was a great concept, but the design came from the original person who pitched it, who was Jan Pinkava. So the look of the film and the overall arc was set up by him, but it got stuck. And they were in cycle, and it was not working. And the way we approach things is, if you take something that's hard and you give it to a group, then their first approaches to it are always not working. Right? That's just the nature of it. I mean, if it worked, you're done. But it doesn't. So you're going through iterations, trying to fix things and trying to get towards something that's good, and sometimes making major changes along the way. In this case, so we have to support a team when they're working on something and we know what they're working on doesn't work. Now, how do you judge that? Our only way of judging is what is how well is the team working together? If the team works well together, then we will do whatever we can to support and help them because we know what they're trying to do. The only rule is the director cannot lose the confidence of the team. So in this case, the director, who I say was a lovely man, had lost the confidence of his team. At that particular time, Brad Bird had finished The Incredibles, and we asked him to take it over. And he liked the concept, he liked the challenge, so he agreed to do it, but under the condition that he not be listed as the director of the film. And there's actually a thing in Hollywood, sometimes the directors don't want the name on the film, so they replace it with, I think it's Alan Smithy is the name that's used. And so for Steve and John, it was like, oh, well, if that's his condition, we won't let him do it. And I said, well, number one, we're screwed if he doesn't do it, because it's not working. And number two is I do know Brad, and that by the time the film is done, it will be his, and his name will be on it. And so they agreed, and that's what happened. The topic never came up again, and he's the director of the film. But he's a brilliant writer, and he's a brilliant leader. And the original film had some things that got it stuck, including the chef in the original movie was alive. And he sort of sold his soul because of this commercialization of his name. So that's a problem. Whose movie is it? Is it a redemption story for the chef, or is it about Remy the rat? And the other problem was, because rats can't talk to humans, that you never knew what he was thinking. So you go back to his family and tell him what he was thinking and his experience, which then brings the movie to a screeching halt because he's explaining something that the audience just watched. Right? That's not good filmmaking. So when Brad came in, he worked with a writer friend of his, and they killed the chef. So he he had been on television. Remy had admired him. But at this point, the chef is a figment of his imagination, and he knows it's a figment of his imagination. It's like when you talk with yourself, this is his way of doing it. But because he knows it, and you know it's a figment of his imagination, then it's not arbitrary. It's not sort of out of the blue. So this basically solved the major problems that had made the film get stuck. And it turned out to be this brilliant film. And the other thing which you'd like to have with any film, sometimes if you go to a film, you kind of know where it's going to go anyway, but you enjoy the ride. But in this case, he really can't be a little chef in France. It isn't going to happen. So it was how to get to that point and how you surprise people with a satisfying ending. So for me, it was one of our brilliant films. So there are a few that really stood out. Only one film was I really disappointed in, and two of them needed another crank at the wheel. I'm just, inside stuff here, but the thing I should note is that Pixar, by the time I retired, we had completed 21 of the 22 films we started.
Wow.
When
That's
we start
impressive.
something, the creative job is to solve the problem.
Now, I've noticed that animation is changing, especially with the Japanese influence, and they're becoming, getting a lot of impact. They're impacting animation. Is any of that AI, the new ones, the new films?
Not materially. The original things which look kind of sexy with AI actually can't hold up very long, like more than a minute, because they don't have any model of what the character is. It's going to have some impact in the industry. And every time one of the changes happen, there's a predicted positive upside, and typically there's a unexpected downside. In this case, I think there's probably more predicted downside to it because there's so many changes are now obvious. And there's a lot of fear. I mean, it's justified fear. But if you think about it, when the internet first came out, people were saying this is going to change everything and it's going to democratize information. Now, in fact, it did. But it also democratized disinformation. And with Facebook, when it came out, it was going to enable groups to get together and share information with families or groups and so forth. It did do that, but also enabled toxic subgroups. So with each one of these, there's sort of like this optimistic, business-oriented thing, like a way of making money for it, but then it turns around. And right now, as we know, it's enabled abuse and scams and so forth. When we just see this going on, and we're subject to it. And one of the uses of AI is it will enable more fraud, which, unless you're really alert, then it's easy to get caught up in it. So if you're paying attention, you can watch this going on. But if you're not paying attention, or in some cases, as people get older, they also lose some judgment, and they can get defrauded. So these dynamics are still going on, as well as the expectations of companies is for high compound growth of the company, which actually orients them towards short term. And in many cases, in the case of General Electric with Jack Welch, it actually ended up destroying the company because the illusion of a growth rate that was faster than was feasible just screwed up a lot of things. And of course, in GE, that was that thing that we grew up with. Like, it is no more. So for me, it's a complicated thing. They're all kind of related. So I talked about the growth of the compute power. The other thing, which is a broader one, is that the compound growth of knowledge. So the size of sensors, the amount of compute power, the cost of them is such that my wife wouldn't let me wear that health ring because she thinks it looks dorky during the daytime. But you got, sensors in there. They're capturing all kinds of useful information about your body, which you can then read a report in the morning. Well, and I've got friends in the medical industry, Johns Hopkins, who are where the information coming in from sensing is getting so much better. But also I'd have to say the care of the medical industry for making sure that it's valid is very good. As an industry, they're very good. So it's this swirling of knowledge which is going on, and it's kind of dizzying. And I can't figure out, is this a good time to die or a good time to be alive?
I'm going to ask the audience if they have any questions for Ed. Right?
Talk about the book. What's in your book? I want to read it.
A New York bestseller.
Oh, good.
Yes.
So I read a lot of business books, and most of them were content free.
How did you get?
Well, no, it's because these are smart people, but they make their business off of doing it. But they're also not practitioners, and we'd been successful. So I went to Bob Iger and said, I should say one thing is, when Disney bought us, there's a lot of contention because they wanted us to merge the two studios together. So, and there was a conflict over that because we wanted to actually bring Disney back because they hadn't done anything successful since Lion King. They're going downhill, and they weren't heading in the right direction. And they knew it. In fact, the night before Bob Iger was appointed to be the new CEO of Disney, he called Steve, who we barely knew. But he called him out of the blue on a Sunday night and said, tomorrow, in confidence, it's going to be announced that I'm the new CEO. I've been around the parks. I've been all these places. I worked with, first at the parks, I found that all the new material is coming from Pixar. I've met with the people at the Disney Animation. They say they've almost got their problem solved, but I don't believe them. I don't know anybody that would know how to fix them. The only group that knows how to do animation is Pixar. Can we talk? So Steve was blown away because essentially Bob Iger starts off by saying, I have a crappy hand. Can we negotiate? And the honesty of that is what made Steve develop this and want to have a strong personal relationship with Bob, which lasted through the end of Steve's life. Just that honesty. And so, and that led to them acquiring Pixar. On the other hand, for us, it was an opportunity to turn Disney around because we'd grown up with these memories because they had this potential to be great. I didn't know any of the people down there, but I did have these theories and beliefs about how things are done. But I was very aware that that in any group, you sometimes are successful, but you aren't giving due credit to everybody else. So if you take your ideas and you apply them to a different group, you may have different outcome. So in working with a different group with these ideas about how to do things, you can actually determine which ones are generalizable to other areas and which ones are actually, they only work in one place, they don't work in the other. And the logic about bringing us together was that we would be spread too thin. It's a perfectly legitimate argument. But it did work. We turned them around, it took a while, and then they became very successful with their films. But they did bring something, like there were things that I didn't realize once I worked with them. So having done that, I then wanted to write down what the complexities of it. So I asked Bob Iger if I could write a book, and he said, no, if you write a book, you're going to leave. It's like, it's like your capstone of your career, and then you move on to something else. I said, no, I'm not going to leave. I just want to write it down. So he gave approval, and so I wrote it. It took about 3 years, something like that. And then when he read it in the end, he said, well, okay, it's a good book, but I think you were too hard on Pixar. I mean, the fact is, if you're actually revealing the problems, which is what we did have, then I think it's more informative to people. That's what makes it more real, was talking about the screw-ups along the way. There was one thing I had put in the book. There were two problems I had when we went public that I wrestled with for a year. In the process of getting it together, one of the things was left out. The one thing that was in the book that did happen was I spent a year trying to figure out what is the next goal, because in achieving the goal of making this first film, I was now left without a goal. So the goal became, how do you make a sustainable creative environment? But the other thing I left out is when I revised it, it was, there are a bunch of things I was trying to address or correct because I learned a lot since then. But one of them, which is an important one to me, was when the film came out with Toy Story and we went public, I asked the question of myself, how much of this was me? Because I'd started this, I'd hired these people. I knew the role that the others had, the directors, Andrew and John and Pete, Joe and all these people. I knew the technical people that aren't known on the outside. They were necessary for this. I knew what George had done and what Steve had done. Like, all this is true. They all contributed. But I wondered how much of it was me. And I wrestled with it for a year. I didn't talk to anybody about it because it actually seemed like a selfish question to ask, an embarrassing question to ask. But at the end of the year, and the reason I say this, is what I realized is while people might ask the question if they're successful, trying to answer it was an active separation. And it never was separate. Like, we don't do things in isolation. It is the fact that we're working with other people that makes the difference, and to appreciate what they do. So it actually is not good to try to solve that problem.
Another question? Yes, Teresa.
The book is a lot about the ethos of
Do you want the microphone,
the workplace.
Teresa? Oh.
Yeah, your book is a lot about the ethos of the workplace that you help create and guide and course correct and all that. And I wondered if there were a few examples you might share about course correction.
Well, we went through a lot of postmortems. We had to change them every time because as soon as you have a successful analysis of what took place, and the next time you to do it, then people have gamed the system. So we kept trying to change how we did it, but we were learning along the way. And but in the process of developing, we put together what we called the Brain Trust. It wasn't really a group of people, but it was a way of working, which we did after films as a way of analyzing it. But as this developed, what we learned is that when people are presenting something, they're vulnerable and they know that it doesn't work and they're talking to colleagues who are very good. So a rule of this meeting is that we want to keep the power out of the room. So the room itself and nobody in the room could tell them what they needed to do. This is only about saying what they thought. So that was a rule. Keep the power of the room. And for the two people who had either real authority to make things go in a different way, or were so articulate they were powerful people, then they were supposed to shut the hell up for the first 15 minutes. And the reason is, it's if you start a conversation with power, then you're altering the way people behave. They respond to what you're saying. But if you enter a discussion, you're now entering as a peer. And in these things, well, I gave a couple of notes. My job really was to look at the dynamics of the room to make sure that worked. And in general, as evidenced by the films, both here at Disney, it worked pretty well. Every once in a while, it went off the rails. And once in a while, magic would happen. And by magic, I mean that ego left the room. And there was intense discussions, or you can call them sometimes contentious if you didn't know, but they were all about the problem. And so that was essentially our truth-seeking mechanism. And it's a general principle, I think, that is necessary for companies. Most leaders would think they have such a mechanism with their team, but generally it's bullshit. Because people manage up, or they've got other agendas in mind. And the trick was always to be able to have a really good corrective to help you get to the truth. An example with Steve, for instance, which almost nobody knows about, is that for 10 years, Pixar was a public company. We had a very good board of directors, but I will say that in 2 times, Steve fired a member of the board of directors. And the reason he let them go was that they never disagreed with him. And he said, if they never disagree with me, then what value are they bringing to the company? Right. So that's where you're going to go, right?
Can we take that method to the board here? Take away the ego. Who's the next president? Are you listening? Yes. More questions?
Wait, far back.
First, I want to thank you for Coco. I think this is a great movie.
Yes.
It gives another twist to about thinking about death. Love it. My question is, at the beginning you talked about publishing. Where were you publishing? Because you are not part of the academia. Were you publishing?
Oh, well.
You say you publish everything.
Oh, in the case of the computer graphics world, then the place to publish was in the proceedings of the conference, of the SIGGRAPH conference. So this ranges between 15 and 30,000 people, but it's from around the world, people who are practitioners in this field publish. We also did other articles and so forth, but that was the one that had the greatest impact. And basically, that's my academic home, and I'm also involved with, Hollywood-based, like with the Motion Picture Academy and so forth, and so there were committees down there, but the closest personal relationships were actually with that community. We go back 50 years.
Yep.
My question is which you mentioned a couple of the films. There was one. Thank you, Sherry. Well, first of all, I want you to know my kids were very young when Ratatouille came out, so I've seen it 20 times, and it's one of my favorites. But my question is you mentioned there was one of your films that you just didn't do well, and I'm curious as to which one that was.
Well, it's the one that actually did financially better than any other film. It was it's Cars 2. It's part of a longer, complex story. It turns out most of the employees at Pixar felt the same, and actually created some internal thing, which is to say it's a very long story. But it's one where I thought, well, okay, the emotional heart and so forth it wasn't great filmmaking. But in terms of selling toys, then it was extraordinarily successful. And there were people who did like it a lot, to be honest. But it's kind of not you kind of want to hit it on both sides. We actually, and people do understand, we have to succeed as a business. We do have to sell, and we do value getting the toys right. And we're very good about paying attention to that whole part of the process. But we also want to achieve the actual sort of good emotional content in any film. We believe strongly in that. So that's one where I just, it was disappointing on that level. But I'd say, incidentally, none of these ever happened because we got pressure from Disney, either about toys or anything else, ever. There was no notion of we're doing product placement. And even when we were not part of them, the whole time, there was no pressure to do something. And after we got there, we weren't getting pressure to make any certain kind of film and so forth. So that whole experience with Disney was a very good one.
Yes, over here.
I'm not a member, so I just want to make sure. I've noticed that the lead characters in many of your films are increasingly female, so thank you for that. And I believe that you've partnered with Gina Davis Media Institute to gather data on the representation of individuals' characters within the film and the amount of screen time. And I was wondering if you've also had similar efforts internally in terms of diversifying your teams, and if that has been the reason that you've started to have more female leads, people of color in leads in the film.
Well, in the first 2 years, first of all, it's a group that's always been open and wanting that, but we kind of fell into, I think, it's sort of a typical line of reasoning, which was true in Silicon Valley, because the bulk of people coming in through the schools was male. So you draw from the pool that's there. But at some point we realized, actually, that isn't the right approach, because we're so public that we need to be both externally and internally more conscious of it. So as an example, we made a series of things which are available on the internet about how we made our films, and the representation of the people in the documentary about how we made the films was actually consciously trying to reflect the broader society, and not, but they weren't actually representative of the true composition of the number of people within Pixar. So saying, actually, people are going to see this. We're better off showing that women or people of color are doing this work in terms of the outside. Internally, it meant that we had to actively promote some women and give them opportunities. And essentially, what we thought at the beginning was that if there are two people who were equally qualified, and there were, for taking advanced positions in the story, which is sort of a grounding place to move on to become director, that if we picked a woman, then some of the men might say, oh, I was equally qualified, they picked her because she was a woman. So we worried about that. Or the woman might think she was picked because she was a woman. Now, but we went ahead and did anyway, and it turns out nobody said they were picked for the wrong reason. And this whole program actually was very successful. And the first person to arise out of this was Domi Shi, who made Turning Red. But she made a film, a short film first, called Bow, which in my mind was the best short film we've ever made. Because essentially you have 7 minutes, and typically you sort of build up to a gag at the end. That's kind of the nature of it. It's all you can do in that limited time. And you have some funny things along the way with a gag at the end. But in this case, she was capturing the essence of the Chinese community in Toronto, where she grew up. And so in the film, there are 2 big surprises and an emotional end that is so hard to pull off. And so he says, okay, it's time for her to make a film. So all this is a result of an active effort to do that. And I have to say also at Cal Arts, when they, at the animation school, which is almost all male, probably in the 70s, that at some point they had awareness of it. So they then started to do blind admission for people entering the school. And then with the blind admission on the work, it was 70% female. So it was, and then even internally, it's like we're wrestling with it. There was one point, this is later in the game there, where I made a mistake in terms of my saying something once. And my relationship with the people at Pixar is if I make a mistake, they'll come to me and tell me I screwed up, which I love, because what it means is that I've made it safe for them to do that. So in this case, I said something which was stupid. And so by the end of the day, I got 3 calls saying I said something that was stupid. So I had to say, okay, why did I miss this? Because we've had all this training about not having implicit bias. And I'm aware of that process or how it works. So I didn't make, it wasn't that kind of mistake. But in trying to think this through, then what I realized is that, which I think is generally applicable, is that I can never be another gender, I can never be another ethnicity, and I can never be raised in another culture. There are experiences of great value which I can never have. All I can do is have faith that people, of all these people, have something of great value to add, even if I don't know what it's going to be.
I have a quick question. These movies are mostly for children, but we all know as adults it's really for us. But have you ever asked children for advice or input?
Well, first of all, you're right, is we don't make them for children, but by having them be animation with certain comedic things, then it's accessible. But you actually have to make them for adults. And even Walt Disney expressed that. He said, we don't make them for children, we make them for the child inside the adult. Which I thought was a good expression. But what we do is, near the end of the film, we will do an audience screening. And we have 2 screenings, one in the afternoon for children and their parents. And the one in the evening is for everybody else. So they're separated. The reason you have to separate them is that if a parent is sitting next to their child, then it distorts their view because they're viewing it in the way their child thinks it, or sees it. And they can't help it. Whereas if you see it with just adults, then you can view it on its own terms. But then when the screening is over, after each one, there's a select group that comes together for a focus group, and there's a very skilled person who goes through a number of topics to find out what worked, what didn't work, and so forth. But in this, you can actually see this process at work. And my favorite one was, which really demonstrates this, was with the movie Inside Out. So a father sitting next to his, I think, 8 or 9-year-old son. And the questioner asked the boy, did he understand this conflict between the character joy and sorrow? And the boy explained that you got both these emotions and they both happen at the same time and you have to accept that they're both there. So the boy just said this, right? This is a movie. Then he asked the father, and the father said, well, I don't think this is appropriate for the young children because they won't get the point of the movie. What the hell?
I'm going to wind this up because all you ladies have to swim home. Thank you, Ed, so much. I know you could tell us many more stories.
I told you, 50 years of rabbit hole.
Yes, yes, but thank you so much. Thank you, Ed.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Happy to be here.